Hello, I'm Thomas and I've been fascinated by economics and investing since I was a kid. Later, while I was studying economics, I co-founded Medium Invest, an alternative investment fund, and for 12 years I've been fortunate to call my passion my profession. One day, a friend of mine who I know to be smart and having the best intentions sent me this viral video and asked what I think. When he saw the video, he was like, "Wow, this guy might be onto something. Could it all be true?" I guess I am his economy guy, and so he sent me the video and asked for my feedback. When I got to listen to the video, I immediately decided I needed to respond in detail to my friend. A bit later I thought this speaks to important general themes about how information spread and is discussed in public, slippery slopes, inflation and the public debt. So I decided to make this very video you're about to watch, and I think you will find it informative and worthwhile to watch. This is an educational video, not financial advice. We will be reviewing the entirety of the original video except the video sponsor part, commenting and providing context. So just to address the question of money up front, I'm happy to promise that our channel either will stay unmonetized forever, or all of the revenue it may generate after any taxes will go to charity without deducting any of our costs. So in terms of direct economic interest, we are sure to lose money doing this. The only way we can get a benefit from doing this is if you think we might be onto something, that we speak the truth. Alright, let's get to it.
So at the recent Eastern Economic Forum in Russia, one of Vladimir Putin's closest advisors said something that got a lot of attention.
Америка прямо сейчас пытается поменять правила на рынке золота и криптовалют. Вспомните, какой у них долг. 35 триллионов долларов.
This theory is floated by one of Putin's close advisors. I just want to point out that tension between Russia and the West has been rising for more than a decade now. Recently, the Danish military intelligence services concluded that Russia is waging hybrid warfare against the West and NATO, and the threat is likely to increase going forward. Planting false stories is part of hybrid warfare. We could call it propaganda. It does not mean that everything the Russian says is false, but we should question their motives and be extra vigilant when reviewing what they have to say.
He said, the United States is preparing to use crypto and stablecoins to secretly devalue its entire $37 trillion debt.
Загоняя всех куда? В криптовалютное облако. Со временем, когда часть госдолга США будет размещена в стейблкоинах, США обесценит этот долг.
He says the United States is plotting to put that debt into a crypto cloud, which would reset the system, basically leaving the rest of the world just holding the bag. Now, this might sound like some crazy theory, but a version of this story has been said before by billionaire CEO of MicroStrategy, Michael Saylor.
Michael Saylor is the co-founder, executive chairman and former CEO of Strategy, formerly known as MicroStrategy. He's a big Bitcoin advocate and has effectively turned Strategy into a Bitcoin holding company.
He actually advised President Trump to, quote, dump all the US gold and buy Bitcoin.
Dump your gold, sell all the US gold, buy Bitcoin, then the trade is free because you could buy 5 million Bitcoin for the cost of the gold. You will demonetize the entire gold asset class, and our enemies hold gold in their banks, so their assets would go to zero. Our assets would go to $100 trillion, and we would control the world's reserve capital network as well as the world's reserve currency network.
Russia and China do own a lot of gold, but US allies owns a lot more. If the US dumped all of the gold reserves, prices for sure would be hurt in the short run. If there are more sellers than buyers, the price will adjust until buyers and sellers balance out. In the long run, it is far more difficult to say how the gold price would react if the US dumped all of the gold reserves. I'm certain it would not go to zero. Maybe the perceived value would be hurt also in the long run. Maybe the rest of the world would just say thank you and buy all of the US gold reserves at a discount, and prices would go to new heights. I do not know, and I think it's hard to say.
The $37 trillion question, though, is how realistic is this, and would this actually work? Because I think the answer is, it's not just gonna work. It's gonna be inevitable, and I think it's going to happen. Not exactly in that way, but that's what I'm gonna help explain in today's video. I wanna show you what Putin's advisor exactly said and how the US will devalue its $37 trillion worth of debt with stablecoins and Bitcoin. It's a really interesting story. So with that said, let's get into it.
What a statement. I'm hooked and eager to see how.
Hi, my name is Henri Jick. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the Bitcoin. So, okay, first question is, who is the person that said all this? Now, his name is Anton Kobiakov, and he is the senior advisor to Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And he's been in that job for over a decade. He basically helps with Russia's messaging at big events like the Eastern Economic Forum. Now, in his speech, he said that the US is trying to rewrite the rules of the gold and crypto markets, and that the ultimate goal of the United States is to push the whole world into what he called the crypto cloud. And once the world is there, he says it's gonna move its huge $37 trillion worth of national debt into assets like stablecoins and then devalue it, which would essentially wipe the slate clean.
So the Russian advisor in question is responsible for messaging. What kind of message do you think Russia wants to push to the West? Think about it for a second.
Okay, second question then is, what does it actually mean to devalue the debt, and how does that work? So here it goes. Imagine that the whole world is just worth this $100 bill. Let's say I borrow all of it, right? Every single dollar. And now I owe and I have to pay it back. The problem is, paying it back the hard way means I have to pay it back and give it back, right? But luckily, I have a special superpower because I control the world reserve currency. So instead of repaying it back with the same $100 bill I just borrowed, I could just create another $100 bill out of thin air. Well, now the world doesn't just have $100 in circulation anymore. It now has $200, which is now trying to buy all the same things in the world because we didn't make more stuff. So what happens next? The price of all those things goes up, right? Things like real estate, stocks, gold, especially the things everybody wants, they all go up. The groceries you used to pay $1 for now cost $2. Everything becomes more expensive because, again, the supply of money doubled, but the supply of stuff stayed the same. That's inflation.
Great simple explanation of inflation. There are lots of different ways to measure inflation, but most are just variations of the same principle, using a basket of different goods and services put together to reflect the real world. And then the average change in price of that basket is the official inflation.
Now, when I go to give you back your $100, it looks like I just repaid you back in full. But in reality, I cheated. Because now your $100 bill doesn't buy you the same amount of stuff because I diluted the money, so it now only buys you half as much. I devalued the debt.
Cheated is maybe pushing it. If we go to the basics of bond investing, the interest rate of the bond is set to reflect the expected inflation, among other things like how likely it is to be paid back in full and for how long the money is lent out. So, if inflation increases more than the bond investors expected, you could argue they just did not do their homework properly. Investors in short-term bills will quickly be at least partly compensated by higher interest rates, while investors in long-term bonds with fixed interest rates will suffer a large loss. If the bond investors are worried about inflation, they can buy Treasury inflation-protected securities, bonds specifically designed to protect against inflation.
Now, what most people don't realize, though, is that this is literally the oldest trick in the book.
Yes, it has been done countless times throughout history and pretty much always ends in tragedy. Just don't do it. Don't do it.
And in a lot of ways, it's how the United States has been paying for its debt this whole time. Devaluing doesn't mean defaulting. It doesn't mean not paying back. It means to lower the real value of that debt through inflation or currency manipulation. And this has happened over and over again throughout time. After World War II, during the inflationary 1970s, and even more recently after the pandemic when we created a ton of new money and then everything went up in price, right? More dollars chasing the same amount of stuff.
That is not an accurate account of US history. The US has been a beacon of sound public finances since the very beginning, and this good financial behavior is one of the reasons the US dollar has become the world's reserve currency. Many countries who have suffered through runaway inflation has tried to peg their currencies to the US dollar to piggyback on the stability and credibility of the US dollar. This graph from the Atlantic shows 221 years of US public debt to GDP from 1790 until 2011. Debt to GDP is a great way to measure the real financial burden of public debt. GDP is the income that can be taxed by the state, so it measures income to debt, which says a lot about the sustainability of the debt and how easy or difficult it is to meet the interest payments. In nominal terms, most countries' public debts go up most years, and that is okay if nominal income rises faster, reducing the real debt burden. Running a budget surplus is great, but it's also okay to grow your income faster than your debt, and the latter might be easier in a world where public policymakers often think more about the next election than the long-term sustainability of the public debt. The US has been consistent, as any nation should, in bringing down debt to GDP in normal years because occasionally war, depression, pandemic, or other major crises hit, and the nation need to respond, drawing on the national reserves by taking on debt to combat the crisis. And by national reserves, I mean the credibility and creditworthiness a nation earns over time. It does not show up as a figure in any financial account, but it is likely the most important asset of any nation. When the crisis is overcome, it is time to reduce the debt to GDP again to be well prepared when the next crisis inevitably occurs. Back in 1790, the federal government assumed state debts from the Revolutionary War and promptly started reducing public debt to GDP. Then the Civil War happened and debt jumped back to what at the time was an all-time high of 30% public debt to GDP. Then the US went back to reducing public debt to GDP until the next major crisis came around, this time World War I. Then the US went back to reducing public debt to GDP until the Great Depression hit, and before the US had fully recovered, World War II broke out and the US public debt reached untold heights of more than 100% of GDP. Then the US promptly went back to reducing public debt to GDP, even running budget surpluses some years, until Ronald Reagan, among other things, restarted the arms race with the Soviet Union, likely accelerating the downfall of the Soviet Union as they could simply not afford to keep up with US military spending. Then the US went back to reducing public debt to GDP and kept it stable during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Then the Great Recession hit, and once again, crisis was successfully combated by drawing on the national reserves and taking on new public debt. This is where our chart ends. For 221 years, the US has been a textbook example of how to manage public debt, and the results has been nothing short of spectacular. It's an easy A+ to the historic US public debt management. And to specifically address the three events mentioned where the US allegedly used inflation or currency manipulation to lower the real value of their public debt. After the Second World War, inflation did briefly spike as wartime price controls was lifted and pent-up demand far exceeded the supply of civilian goods. The spike in inflation was successfully addressed, perhaps even too successfully as prices even turned deflationary. The US ran budget surpluses in that period, paying back the debt in the best way possible, a textbook example of what to do. Then in the 70s, inflation did spike again, mainly driven by the oil shocks. And the public debt to GDP was very low at the time, the lowest it had been in 40 years. The US had just reduced their public debt to GDP from more than 100% following World War II to less than 30% in only 25 short years. I struggle to understand how anyone can claim the US used inflation or currency manipulation to lower the real value of their public debt in the 70s or following the Second World War. Then we had the latest significant inflation spike following the 2020 pandemic. Again, it was not intentionally created to get out of public debt, but a result of policy mistakes, supply constraints, and a surprisingly high demand. In my opinion, the politicians did overspend, as they increasingly have been lately, running up the public debt to GDP and running down the national reserves. And the US Central Bank did make a significant policy mistake. They thought the inflation was temporary, likely influenced by recent memory of having to spend a lot of time and effort to combat deflationary tendencies in the economy. But as we all know today, the inflation was not temporary, and when the central bank realized it, they started fighting the inflation immediately and have been doing a pretty good job since. A costly but honest mistake. Now that we covered the past, let's briefly talk about the present and the future. After the Great Recession in 2009, the US did not go back to reducing public debt to GDP as they had following all prior major national crises. Then the pandemic hit and the US had to draw on the reserves again, with the public debt to GDP taking a big jump, approaching the all-time high previously set by the most costly war in history. When the US public debt last time was at these levels, it was followed by budget surpluses and a quick reduction in public debt to GDP. Today, in relatively normal years without any major national crisis, the public debt to GDP ratio is projected to continue to rise, and that worries me a lot. America is the most wealthy nation in the world, and they have huge reserves to draw on. I do not know how far they can push it, and I do not want to find out. Imagine if the US continues to increase their public debt in the normal years and then crashes into the limit of the reserves in the next major crisis. That would be catastrophic, first and foremost for the Americans, but also for everyone holding US dollar assets, and to a lesser degree the rest of the world. But the important question is not what I think. The important question is, what do you think about it, especially if you are a US citizen? How would you rate the current US public financial behavior? Accuracy and sometimes even truth is often lost in today's fast-paced, polarized informational landscape. That is, generally speaking, worrisome, and I think the US public debt discussion is a good example. All else being equal, the Americans are less likely to make a course correction back to their historic, spectacular, successful path if they are told what they are doing today is nothing out of the ordinary, that what they are doing today is what they have been doing for a very, very long time. However, if we accurately tell the spectacular, successful history of the US economy, the Americans are more likely to recognize the starkly different choices made by their policymakers today, and maybe, just maybe, public opinion and policy could shift.
So when Russia's advisor says that the US might use crypto to devalue its debt, he's not telling us anything new, right? He's describing something the US has been doing for a really long time. Now, if you take that same trick I just explained and you push it out to the rest of the world, that's what stablecoins let you do. And just to be clear, this isn't literally exchanging the $37 trillion into stablecoins. It's using dollar-pegged stablecoins backed by treasuries to spread liabilities globally. When those dollars are inflated, the loss gets shared by anyone holding the tokens, but we'll get into that later.
We are now at the video sponsor segment, which we will skip. It is true that the cost of inflation is partly shared by anyone holding the currency in question. We will get into it in much more detail later.
Now let's get back to it. But now, here's arguably the most important thing you'll ever understand about the economy. And this is credit to Jeff Booth for this one. Just remember this all the time. The natural state of the economy is deflationary. So what does that mean? Well, it means if the amount of money in the entire world stayed the same, like let's say there was only ever this $100 bill in the entire world, right? And it was always that amount. Over time, as technology gets more efficient, as we get better and better at making stuff, the price of everything would naturally go down. Things would get cheaper because productivity goes up, but the money supply stays the same. That is the natural order of the universe. It's decay. Things get cheaper over time. And that's how it should be.
Big statements. If we start with the smaller one, that the natural state of the economy is deflationary, that is true based on two simple assumptions: that we can produce more goods with the same input over time and that money supply is stable. I think it's a clever, insightful and thought-provoking statement. Now on to the big statement, that deflation is how it should be. I know I'm wrong sometimes, and I'd rather found out sooner than later. Responding well when you are wrong works wonders in the long run. You might end up being right more often than not. So I did a bit of research, listened to Jeff Booth, and my preliminary conclusion is as follows. Starting with a practical question. How would we ever manage a transition from an inflationary to a deflationary economy with our current debt levels? The historic precedent for deflation in economies with high debt levels is very bad. So, realistically speaking, is it even a viable option? If deflation is superior, you could argue significant short-term pain is justified for the long-term gain. So let's keep going. The trajectory of the US public debt is unsustainable and needs to be addressed. Is the best way to do it a completely new monetary system that is extra painful to introduce when you start out with high debt? The US has been here before and managed it very well. We had a decade, give or take, of bad US public debt management and more than 200 years of great US public debt management. The solution can be as simple as going back to what the US has done for more than 200 years with spectacular results. So is deflation or inflation the superior system? Deflation sounds enticing, making your money worth more over time. But when you think about it, that's actually already the world we live in, at least when we do not need to stimulate our economy. If the interest rate is higher than inflation as it is today, your money does become worth more over time, even if it not always feels like it. And if inflation is higher than the risk-free interest rate, you do have the option to invest in other assets and get higher returns along with more risk. Human behavior and irrational biases are a big part of how the economy works. For instance, when the central banks tried to stimulate the economy with negative interest rates, people did all kinds of crazy things to avoid paying negative 0.1%. It just felt wrong to many people, but it would have been much more rational to react when interest rates was cut from 1% to 0%, a change 10 times the size. Human feelings and behavior are not always rational. When we expect money to be worth more in the future, we are less likely to spend and invest today. Historically, this has caused a dangerous deflationary spiral where deflation leads to decreased consumption, decreased investments, and higher real debt burdens, which leads to slower economic growth and more deflation, which then again leads to lower consumption, lower investments, and then we have a negative self-reinforcing spiral. If we wave a magic wand and takes the debt out of the equation, the spiral is less severe, but the core problem still remains. In an inflationary economy, we have the opposite effect. People consume and invest more because we know the money will be worth less in the future. If the economy is in risk of overheating, the central bank can raise interest rates and make consumption and investments less attractive, cooling down the economy. If the economy is collapsing, the central bank can lower interest rates and make consumption and investments more attractive, helping the economy to recover. When interest rates hit their natural floor of 0 or slightly negative, central banks turn to their secondary and much less effective policy tool of printing money to stimulate the economy. It may not feel like it, but in a historic context, we have actually become pretty good at managing economic crisis. The Great Recession of 2009 could have become the second Great Depression. Luckily, it did not. and the Great Pandemic could have become a much larger economic crisis. In both cases, huge government intervention, shoring up the confidence in the economy, convincing most people everything was okay, making people spend and invest again, saved the economy. It was not perfect. We should have pulled back some of the support earlier, but in a historic context, it was a huge success. And if there's something history teaches us, it is that economic boom and bust cycles is inevitable. It is part of human behavior. In a deflationary economy, monetary policy cannot efficiently address economic crisis. The real interest rate cannot be negative and encourage investing and spending because the nominal interest rate cannot go much below zero, and then deflation makes the real interest rate positive. Also, the money supply is supposed to be fixed. And my question is, if we blunt the main and secondary policy tool of the only institution solely tasked with creating the optimal economic conditions, how will we address future economic bust cycles? And speaking of history, the modern economic miracle happens to roughly coincide with the invention of the modern monetary system and the creation of the central banks in the form we know today. Before that, the natural order of the world was that money supply was dictated by whatever happened to be available as a medium of exchange we could all agree on, historically often gold or silver or similar scarce resources. I'm not claiming any causality, but I am pointing out that there is no historic evidence that our current monetary system is bad, and if we were to deduct something from history, it would be that our current monetary system is pretty good. We are very fortunate to live in a world which gets more and more productive over time, so we have more income and more wealth to share, but sharing can be difficult. A significant part is policy decisions, but let's look at the inherent properties of each system. The default choice is often inaction. Just think about the subscription services you are offered for free at first. The companies offering these services rely on the fact that many people will never get to cancel the subscription, and so ends up paying for something they would never actively have chosen to purchase at the full price. In a deflationary economy, this type of inaction means less of the productivity gains ends up with the consumer. Say that each year a given product can be produced a bit cheaper. If prices are kept stable because of inaction, then none of the productivity gains is passed on to the consumer. If we have a low, stable inflation, the default choice of inaction, keeping the prices stable, is passing the productivity gains on to the consumer. There are plenty more advantages of a low, stable inflation. It helps overcome our behavioral resistance against lowering prices or going down in wage. If a product, an employee, a sector, or perhaps an entire country has become uncompetitive, inflation helps them become competitive again without going through the psychological pain of seeing their nominal income reduced. It is not without reason that the decades-long stagnant deflationary economy of Japan is called the lost decades, and it's not without reason that the central bank, who is solely tasked with creating the optimal economic environment, is aiming for a stable inflation of around 2% each year.
But if you think about it, that's not how the world we live in actually works for some reason. And that's because governments can make more money.
Money is mostly made by the banks, and the one bank who rule them all is solely tasked with creating the optimal economic conditions. It is run by humans and thus not fail-proof, but it's the best system we have come up with so far. We should take care to keep the immense power of the central bank away from people who might be corrupted by it. People who cannot resist the temptation of short-term gain at the expense of long-term pain.
And when they do, that's when you hear, oh, wait a minute, gold, real estate, stocks, Bitcoin, that's hit an all-time high. But the reality is, it's not really that those assets are going up in price. What's really happening is that the dollar's going down because we're making more of them. So it now takes more of them to buy the same thing. And when the new money floods the system, all that extra liquidity, as it's called, has to find a home. It has to find a place to go so that it doesn't become worth less. So it gets put into things like real estate, stocks, gold, Bitcoin, which is also why over the long run, those assets look like they go up forever. In reality, they're just holding their purchasing power, while the money that's underneath all of that gets weaker and weaker.
Great visuals and great narrating. Unfortunately, it's not an accurate representation of reality. On Jeremy Siegel's famous graph on the left, you can see reality. It shows the long-term returns of stocks, bonds, bills, gold, and the US dollar adjusted for inflation, which is the same thing as saying in constant purchasing power. Note that the graph is logarithmic, which means it goes from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000, not from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. This is a neat way to show long-term returns because a compounding return of, say, 6.9% in real terms on average shows up as a straight line. Inflation does increase the nominal value of most assets, and that is not real value creation. Most serious discussion about historical returns either uses numbers corrected for inflation or explicitly states whether the returns are before or after inflation.
So then the question is, what if you can expand this superpower, right? You could widen the same trick beyond the US borders. That's where stablecoins come in. Okay, but hold on. If the US can already devalue its debt with regular inflation, what does it matter if it can do the same with stablecoins, right? This is why Russia's advisor thinks the US will actually do this. The answer comes down to distribution and control. You see, when the US inflates the dollar, the economy starts to feel the pain right away. We all see the higher grocery bills, right? The more expensive house prices, the energy costs going up, potentially higher interest rates to cool it down. Those CPI and consumer price index reports go up, and then people get upset, right? But stablecoins, they change that equation. Because stablecoins park reserves in short-term US treasuries, so the demand for dollars in treasuries can actually go up as adoption grows, making the whole thing kind of self-reinforcing. Every time someone uses USDT or USDC throughout the rest of the world, they're basically holding a digital IOU backed by US treasuries. That means they are indirectly helping fund America's debt without actually buying US treasuries, right?
It is literally on the front page of USDC and USDT that they are redeemable for US dollars and fully backed by cash and cash equivalents. So I hope that part is not news to most people who use them. The people who are surprised by this is the reason other more well-informed people can make unreasonable good money in the financial markets.
So if the US devalues its debt through inflation, the burden doesn't just hit American citizens. It gets exported worldwide through the stablecoin system. So inflation then becomes kind of a shared tax that stablecoin holders everywhere are forced to pay because their digital dollars also lose purchasing power at the same time. Now, this is also technically true of today's system because dollars are everywhere throughout the world, but this would become a much bigger market that would also exist on people's smartphones.
So all of this clever plotting by the US, luring people into stablecoins who do not realize that the underlying asset of a stablecoin pegged to the US dollar is the US dollar. It only matters if the stablecoin market becomes much bigger because that is exactly how the current system already works. To be able to assess the potential impact of stablecoins, we have to go to our first advanced class. Welcome to Inflation 201. It's time to talk about the many costs of runaway inflation. Runaway inflation is inherently unstable and creates uncertainty about the future. If inflation gets out of control, maybe it's 20% today, 50% tomorrow, and 3 digits next year. Nobody knows, and that is a big problem. It also comes with high friction costs as businesses and consumers are unsure what the right price is and must spend time setting and validating prices. Runaway inflation can also reduce the purchasing power of wages and pensions if they are not effectively indexed to inflation, somewhat randomly redistributing income and wealth. Runaway inflation can also lead to higher effective tax rates. Taxes are paid on nominal income. So, say you predicted the surge in inflation and invested in assets with durable economic value. As inflation increases, so does the nominal value of your assets. It looks like you had an economic gain, but in reality you just managed to preserve your real purchasing power. Then the taxman comes knocking on your door, wanting to tax the nominal gain you just had, with the result that everyone ends up effectively paying higher taxes in real terms, and even those who predicted the runaway inflation may end up worse. Inflation can also make domestic businesses less competitive on the global market and harm exports if currencies do not fully compensate for the high inflation. So, if inflation is that terrible, how come countless countries throughout history has ended up there? I think the main reason is that much of the real cost of inflation is hidden, especially in the short term. The perceived cost of inflation is much lower than the real cost. It is hard to deny that a tax increase or a spending cut is real. It is much easier to deny the indirect tax increases from taxation of nominal gains driven by inflation, or deny the reduced purchasing power from public spending and pensions not fully indexed to inflation. Also, you can more easily claim that everyone else but you are to blame for the inflation. And the best guarantee against runaway inflation is an independent central bank. Can stablecoins be used to meaningfully shift the cost of inflation from Americans to the holders of stablecoins? Today, the outstanding supply of stablecoin is around 0.8% of the US public debt. If we try to peek into the future and use ARK Invest 2030 growth forecast for stablecoins, the total supply of stablecoins in 2030 will be 2.7% of the forecast US public debt at the time. Most of the reserves backing up the stablecoins are placed in short-term treasuries, the part of the US public debt that is best protected against inflation. Then we have all of the private debts. Then we have all of the other US denominated assets and liabilities. Then we have all of the other costs of inflation not directly linked to assets and liabilities. I struggle to see any plausible scenario in which stablecoins can be used to meaningfully shift the cost of inflation from Americans to the holders of stablecoins.
And here's the other piece of the puzzle. Stablecoins can look neutral because they could be created by private companies, not just the government. What that means is they don't carry the same political baggage that, is associated with the Federal Reserve or the Treasury. And under the Genius Act, it says only approved issuers like banks, trust companies, or non-bank firms can get special approval. They can issue regulated dollar-backed stablecoins in the United States. So if Apple or Meta wanted to, they could create their own currency like MetaCoin, right? All they got to do to get approval is just suck up to the president a little, right?
How much are you spending, would you say, over the next few years?
I think it's probably going to be something like, at least $600 billion.
Show your loyalty, spend a little bit of money.
Yeah, that is not pretty to watch.
And that's why stablecoins are going to play such a huge role in the devaluation of our debt.
Stablecoins are tiny relative to the cost of any potential runaway inflation in the US, and it is very difficult to see any plausible scenario where stablecoins would make a real difference in the future.
It's kind of CBDC level of control without the CBDC brand. Now here's why. The rest of the world wants no part in any of this. And we know it doesn't because of how much gold the world has been buying. That's what's happening to gold right now. Countries are like, we don't want your stablecoins. give us gold because it was the agreed upon standard for thousands of years. So let's just go back to that. But why don't they want any part of this, right? It's because even though stablecoins are supposed to be backed one-to-one by real US assets like dollars or treasuries, in theory, every single stablecoin in circulation should have a real dollar or bond equivalent sitting right behind it. The problem is there's no way for a person or a foreign government to audit that claim with 100% certainty. Companies like Tether and Circle release reports, but you have to trust the issuer and the auditor, and they're all mostly US-based. And when it comes to trust, especially when it comes to trillions of dollars, that's a big ask between countries. Even if one day blockchain technology makes it possible to fully audit those reserves in real time, that still doesn't really solve the bigger problem, which is that the US can always change the rules.
Audits are not guarantees. Be careful who you trust, think for yourself, and use common sense. And gold is very popular right now, and the general distrust and inflationary risk is definitely a big part of the reason why.
Remember, the government once promised that dollars would always be redeemable for gold, and then in 1971, Nixon just rug pulls everyone, right? That link was cut. So from the world's perspective, that was kind of like the ultimate rule change, right? That was the promise of redemption and then just kidding. So a trust us token isn't really going to cut it. There's nothing technical that stops the US from doing the exact same thing, but this time with stablecoins. That's why there is so much distrust in the world about moving to this new digital system.
Gold has been valuable for thousands of years, more or less directly linked to the value of money. Officially, the US dollar was only tied to gold in 1900, and you could argue it was doomed to fail from the beginning because the optimal growth in money supply would eventually outstrip any gold reserve. The gold standard was partly suspended in 1933 by Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression before Richard Nixon completely severed the link in 1971. At that time, many other countries had already left the gold standard, so it was not an entirely unpredictable event. So, at first a dollar was worth a dollar, then a dollar was worth a dollar or some gold, then a dollar was worth a dollar or some less gold, and finally a dollar was worth a dollar again. Private actors creating stablecoins and promising that a dollar worth of stablecoin is worth a dollar and backing up that claim by an equivalent reserve of dollars is not at all relatable to the gold standard. Something that would be relatable is if the US government declared that a dollar is worth a dollar or a set fraction of a Bitcoin, but they have not. And the US government has made no promises about stablecoins, so technically they cannot do to stablecoins what they did to the gold standard.
So then the next question is, will the US actually do this then? I actually think it's more possible, maybe even inevitable, that the US is already experimenting with this idea, just not in the way that we hear about it. For example, Michael Saylor, he was very public, right? He's advised Donald Trump and his family that America should have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. His plan was if the US sold off all its gold and bought Bitcoin, it would crush gold prices, it would hurt competing countries like China and Russia, and at the same time, it would send Bitcoin's price way up and recapitalize America's balance sheet. But in the end, that's not what ended up happening. Instead, during Trump's presidency, the idea of this US Bitcoin reserve, it ended up being just an idea that was teased, but it was never fully something that became real. The US said it would never use taxpayer dollars to buy any Bitcoin, and it really hasn't been buying any, at least not that we know of publicly. So I don't think it's going to happen the way Michael Saylor was advising publicly would happen. But this is where the private angle comes in. Because while the government might not be openly buying Bitcoin, there's a backdoor. There's another way this could happen behind the scenes. So think about MicroStrategy, right? This stock. The company has basically become a public Bitcoin proxy with Michael Saylor. They've been buying Bitcoin nonstop. They now hold hundreds of thousands of Bitcoins. So what if Instead of the US government buying Bitcoin directly and then risking global panic, what if it's easier to just let a corporation do it first? That way, it doesn't look like some central bank operation and no one's really paying attention. And then later, if Bitcoin really does become a strategic asset, the US government could take in and take a partial stake in MicroStrategy, the same way it took 10% ownership in companies like Intel. So this precedent already exists. I mean, think about it. Why would the US openly risk crashing the gold market with a $1 trillion Bitcoin purchase or a forced stablecoin rollout? Why would it sell its gold if it still has any, right? It's way easier and much smarter just to let private companies do the heavy lifting first, let them experiment, and then the US government could come in and adopt what's already working. That's how the US has always played the game. Innovation starts privately, and when it becomes way too important to ignore, it gets absorbed nationally, right? This way, it's way more subtle, way more gradual, and it's kind of deniable until the day it becomes official.
Sounds like clever plotting by the US. Let's try to unpack it. The US did acquire a stake in Intel. How did the US acquire the stake? It paid the market price at the time. The unusual thing was that the government used grants promised under the previous administration as payment, effectively cancelling the grants and then handing the money over again, this time as payment for the equity stake. I am not a fan of this. It is a slippery slope. However, it would not change much if the US was to take a stake in Strategy, formerly known as MicroStrategy, in this way. If Bitcoin at that time has become much, much bigger, so would the market value of Strategy, and the US would have to pay whatever it is worth at the time, nullifying any meaningful gain for the US. It's not a clever backdoor. And consider for a moment what the consequences would be if the US was to take control of some of the supply of Bitcoin by force in a way most people consider wrong. That is the very thing Bitcoin was created to avoid. What do you think would happen to the value of Bitcoin if the US did that?
But the point I'm trying to make is that there's a lot of ways that this could happen and probably will happen. So yes, the Russian advisor is 100% correct in his assumption that that's what the US will most likely do at some point in the future if it cares about solving its national debt. But whatever ends up happening, either way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments below. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. I'd love to see you back here next week. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Is the US plotting to reset their $37 trillion public debt using stablecoins and bitcoins? Is it just a Russian hoax created to cause internal unrest and distrust in the West? I will not conclude for you, but instead encourage you to make up your own mind and think for yourself. I am worried about potential inflation in the US. We could cover how to think and handle that as a private individual in another video, but as society we are lucky to have a great, simple solution available if the Americans cares about solving their national debt. They could do what they have done for more than 200 years with spectacular results. Run small budget deficits and let the productivity gains and low stable inflation take care of the rest. I want to highlight it was a pure coincidence that this specific video was forwarded to me and I was asked for my input. I am trying to address the substance of the theory and other important general topics such as inflation, public debt, and how information spread and is discussed in public, not pick on any individual. These topics are important and deserve a civil, constructive, public conversation. I do hope you found this video informative. At the time of recording, the original video has 3.9 million views. If you think more people should watch this reply, give it a like and let me know what you think about the US public debt, maybe grading it in the comments below to help the YouTube algorithm spread this video, or maybe share it with a friend. You never know what sharing a video with a friend can lead to. Take care and think independently.